If there was a gene that the activation of which led to a cure or immunity to cancer, would you switch that gene on in every human being? Genuine question. Okay, what about this then? Let's say there was a gene that, if switched off, prevented people from becoming criminals. Would you switch off that gene? If not, why not? Why is it okay in one condition but not in another? Hopefully you'll have a better understanding of that argument by the end of this lesson, and certainly based on our discussions next time. So as promised, this is lesson 4, biological explanations of criminal behaviour. We're going to look at the genetics and neural explanations of why some people commit crimes. So the first is genetic explanations. There is no crime gene, so you're safe. You don't have to switch that gene on or off. There is no single gene linked to crime as the cause of crime. Instead, it's more likely going to be the interaction of a number of different genes. Remember, biopsychologists believe that behavior is largely determined by the nervous system, whether it's the central nervous system, the brain, with influence from the peripheral nervous system as well. As a result, that nervous system is actually built based on the genetic code. So that genetic code will influence it, and if it's faulty or if you get particular parts of the code passed down, that will influence the way your nervous system operates. So when we investigate the effect of biology on behavior, we can't really just carry out lab experiments. We can't interfere with people's genes. So what we do is we do family studies, and we compare, for example, whether the father and the child both have criminal tendencies, and if they do, we say that there has a high concordance rate. A good source is Osborne and West, who looked at the rate of criminality for sons whose fathers were either criminals or non-criminals, and as you can see, 40% of the sons of criminals also became criminals. That is really strong. That's a strong argument. However, hashtag not all. We have a 60% missing from that case. So what happened to the other 60%? So this would be an argument for soft determinism, and the criticism of it would be that 60% do not follow in their father's criminal footsteps. Perhaps there are slightly more robust and scientific approaches to use twin studies, in which case we eliminate some of the variables, such as appearance trait, which can influence our behaviour as well. So remember, monozygotic or identical, dizygotic or non-identical twins. And some of the most convincing studies come from Denmark, where they have this huge amount of data, this registry of twins that researchers have been working with for many years. Christensen is an example, found a much higher concordance rate amongst monozygotic twins for criminality than dizygotic twins, which is indeed 35 to 13%. Now, why it's useful to actually contrast these two types of twins is that they both live in the same house, probably, of the parents. So you can control for environment. Otherwise, you might have a case where the monozygotic twins just happen to live in houses with really aggressive or criminal parents. Dalgarden, Kringland, 1976, found similar results with monozygotic 26% and dizygotic 15%. So the difference there has got to be largely the genes. However, remember, dizygotic twins can be different sexes, and we know girls commit fewer crimes. So these are all issues to take into account when looking at twin studies. Okay, so what are the genes? I said there's no single gene causes it, but there are a few candidates that might be linked. And the first one that you've already heard of, though perhaps you don't know much about, is the MAOA gene. Brunner, a researcher, noted members of criminal families were more likely to have a gene responsible for low levels of MAOA activity. What's referred to as cadherin 13, which is also which causes these sort of low levels. MAOA then, some background for you. You can have read that. You don't actually need to know what it does, though if you're studying biology you might want to investigate a little further. And this is basically what the research shows. And this is evidence for a diathesis stress model. If you look at disposition towards violence, we have low MAOA group. When you combine low MAOA with severe maltreatment, we get this huge effect size. Even when, and if we look specifically at conviction rates, it is significantly higher than the high MAOA activity group. So strong evidence that this gene and the enzyme it codes for has a significant effect, influence on criminality. But it's not just things like enzymes and hormones, it's also things like cognitive functioning. So your cognitive functioning is partly dictated by your genes. Think about your IQ, for example, regulating behavior, your impulsivity, all that could be passed down through the genes. Abnormalities in the autonomic nervous system, including unresponsive to mild stimuli. So maybe you need powerful stimuli to really get a response out of it. That may make learning difficult in school, therefore you may mess around. You may be less educated, as a result have fewer prospects. You may be poorer. Poverty is linked to crime. Boom, we've taken those steps. Endocrine abnormalities as well, such as testosterone levels too high. Serotonin has been linked as well as a neurotransmitter. We'll talk about that in a minute. So diathesis stress, this seems to be the more plausible explanation, that people are born with particular genes and that the activation of these genes and the particular environment they happen to be in is what leads to increased criminal behaviour. So you've looked at epigenetics before under the biological approach, so you should know a little bit about this. But essentially, environmental triggers can change which genes are expressed. So certain genes may be inhibited by malnourishment or poverty-related conditions. Abuse in childhood is another example. Caspi used data from longitudinal study in New Zealand. The study followed around 1,000 people from when they were babies back in the 70s. Caspi et al. Assessed antisocial behaviour at age 26 and found 12% of those men with low MAOA genes had experienced maltreatment. So that relates to the graph that we looked at. It's not enough just to have the genes, we've got to have the environmental triggers as well. So what about neural explanations? Now this one may surprise you. 8.5% of the US population have had a brain injury of some kind, so quite low rates. But according to Harmon in 2012, 60% of the US prison population have had head injuries. Now, the two don't perfectly equate, and again it's correlational, possibly not causational, because it may be that if you're a violent criminal you're more likely to get hit in the head than if you're a upstanding member of the community. But very interesting that it could be a form of brain damage that's causing it. Another candidate for influence on behaviour is the prefrontal cortex. This is our moral agent that sits in the front and really tells us what's right from wrong. RAIN, 71 separate studies using brain imagery, reduced functioning in the prefrontal cortex of violent offenders' brains and psychopaths. Lower activity is associated with things like impulsivity, not being able to delay gratification. So it could be prefrontal cortex abnormalities, could be brain damage, could be MAOA, or a mix of the lot. The limbic system, RAIN again, studied murderers who were found not guilty by reason of insanity. Compared with the control, they were found to have abnormal asymmetries. Remember, asymmetries means one side is developed differently to the other in the limbic system of the murderers, especially in the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is interesting. It's the gateway of the emotions, and it's responsible for things like fear. One of the things that murderers may not have is as salient a fear reaction as non-murderers. Neurotransmitters, as I sort of hinted at earlier, serotonin is linked. Both low and high levels have been associated with criminality. Low levels may predispose individuals to impulsive aggression, partly because the neurotransmitter normally inhibits the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine hyperactivity may enhance this effect, so neurotransmitters may conspire to increase your criminal tendencies. Noradrenaline high and low levels are linked to aggression, violence, and criminality. High levels, overstimulation of the fight or flight system. Low levels reduce the ability to perceive threats. So that's if you have less ability to perceive threats, you're going to be less afraid and you're going to get more sticky situations. Overstimulation of the fight or flight is going to mean that you're going to fly off the handle. If it's fight that you choose, a very low threshold for triggering that may cause you to be active quite frequently in aggressive pursuits. Evaluation then, the research. We got all the research that we covered so far can count as evaluation. Crow looked at adopted children, 50% higher crime rate if their biological parent had a criminal record. So this says that the environment for adopted kids is not the predictor of criminality, though you could argue that early environments such as care or potentially being institutionalized could have influenced them. Mednick's study, 14,000 adoptees, 15% adopted by criminal families went on to become criminals, 20% whose biological parents were criminals went on to be criminals. Now, those numbers seem quite similar, but they're not. If you think about it, 15% adopted by criminals into a criminal environment became criminals. Out of all the people adopted, 15%. Whereas 20% of those adopted became criminals, suggesting that genes play a big role. Blognigan found support for a genetic basis for criminal personality. He looked at over 600 male and female twins. So maybe it's a personality thing. Definitely delayed gratification or failure to delay it and impulsivity are important. And Findlay points out that crime is neither a natural or homogeneous category of behaviour, it is a social construction. So what do we mean by someone who's a murderer because they come home and they're violent rage, they kill their partner's lover in a feat of just madness, compared to the stalker who stalks and fantasizes and kills his victim. So, some research to back up the biological approach. Further evaluations, lots of these, some generic. It's a nomothetic approach. General laws could be used to predict behaviour. Suffers from genetic determinism, potentially. The law, the legal system, does not recognise it as a defence, but should they? If you have low MAOA activity, it's not fair, if I've got high and you've got low and you get in a fight and go to jail and I'm in the same situation but I can respond more easily, it seems unfair. And what about stereotyping? If we can easily detect physical characteristics, biological, whatever they may be, of criminals, surely this will lead to stereotyping. It's largely biologically reductionist. Most of these issues are correlational, and therefore we cannot really establish cause and effect. But there are practical applications for treatment in identification. If we know, for example, that a criminal is going to be less responsive to stimuli, we can teach them cognitive methods, coping methods, to avoid, for example, impulsivity and so forth. The other thing is, most of these studies may be fundamentally flawed in that they focus mostly on aggression and not on criminality, and the two are not necessarily linked. So those are the evaluations for this section. We have looked at the genetic and neural explanations for criminal behaviour. We have talked about some of the research, some of the types of methodologies we use, including twin studies and family studies, as well as some of the limitations of those as well. Have a look at the quick quiz underneath the video, and if you have any questions, please email me or ask them next time. Once again, thank you very much for your time, and I hope this video was useful. Take care. Bye.